Morning, good afternoon, good evening. The other day, I had a discussion based on the Twitter from Nelson Chamisa, which is on the screen there on the left and on the right hand side, in which he's talking of unity makes perfect, and it is claiming that he has been negotiating with his old friends, Professor Walshman Newett and IBT, Douglas Monzora, Job Scala, and they're coming together again to form a united front. This is a game for love and hate. The opposition have divided, merged, divided, merged. Both sides, as much as they hate each other, they can't, to justify their continued participation in these flawed elections, they have to come together. And here is somebody, there half screen there by Shaiba Gabriel, asking the Chamisa Chete Chete supporters whether they are now going to apologize to Tendai BT, Welshman Nguve, etc., whom they had denounced as sellouts. It's not the first time that the supporters have come out strong, condemning. In fact, in this case here, even Chamisa himself resigned from Triple C, saying that it had been infiltrated by ZANU-PF agents. So Gabriel's asking the pertinent question, are Chamisa and his supporters going to now apologize to these opposition leaders? The truth of the matter is, Zimbabwe's opposition will never win flawed elections. So flawed that the logical step is to withdraw, as David Coulthard aptly put it. Instead of addressing the issue of reforms, they are again and again resorting to focusing on unity to justify their continued participation in the flawed elections. This is at the heart of the problem here. Yes, sometimes we've heard arguments being made that a divided opposition will never win the election. The opposition has failed to win elections in Zimbabwe not because they are divided, but because ZANU-PF rigs elections. That point must be understood. We can't go anywhere unless you understand that fundamental problem. Professor Jonathan Moyo in 2008 was absolutely right when he said that if the elections in Zimbabwe were free, fair, and credible, and the donkey was the only other alternative on the ballot paper instead of Mugabe, people vote for the donkey. That underlines how desperate people of Zimbabwe are for change. So one is going to ask, why then if we fail to achieve any meaningful change? Well, the reason is there's never been free, fair, and credible elections. This comes back to what happened during the GNU of 2008 to 2018. The MDC leaders had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms, and they failed to implement even one token reform. Why? Because they bribed them with the trappings of high office, and they forgot about the reforms. And ever since, they've been participating in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, knowing fully well that participating would give ZANU-PF legitimacy. As David Coulthard himself readily admits in his book, this is him talking about the 2018 elections. What we cannot deny as a people is the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground shows that we have got a regime that is hell-bent on rigging the elections. We have an opposition that had the opportunity to implement the reforms but failed to do so. That is the reality we have got to deal with. In the past, notably that year 2013, when the opposition participated as MDCN led by Ncube and MDCT led by Trangirai. They lost a number of seats, notably in Matabeleland South and North and part of the Midlands. And the vote count was such that if the opposition had not divided the vote, they would have won the parliamentary seat. In other words, we came up with a result that would show that ZANU-PF garnered, for the sake of argument, 40% of the votes, and the two opposition parties among themselves divided among themselves 60%. In other words, if they'd been united, they would have won that parliamentary seat. And this has fueled this argument that the opposition must be united. The truth of the matter is ZANU-PF has always operated the system that it is guaranteed to deliver a ZANU-PF majority in parliament and to win the presidential election. 2008, we had the runoff. Ever since, we have not had the runoff because ZANU-PF presidential candidate, the system has allowed him to keep topping up his votes until he wins. Here is a scenario that was revealed in the 2018 Constitutional Court challenge by Chamisa of the presidential result. I want you to listen to the proceedings.
Zimbabwe, they've now held their recent elections, which went well.
International monitors had to force their way through angry crowds to deliver their verdict. They reported serious flaws in the process. It was not a level playing field. Many injured and 3 dead. The opposition says the shootings and the beatings cannot be justified. And an election in which Zimbabwe dared to dream has instead brought back its worst nightmares. There were running battles through the city centre and the streets echoed to the sound of gunfire.
Zimbabwe, they've now held their recent elections, which went well.
You are ready now to start. I am ready. You may start.
Thank you, my lord. What ZEC has done is to violate the constitution, to violate the Electoral Act in a manner which has ultimately benefited the first respondent. National and Central, page 159, the report by the ZBC, it does 2 things. Number 1, it mentions figures. Number 2, it attributes those figures to a ZEC official. It says by 5:30 p.m., 105,000 people had voted in National and Central. The final figure that one gets from ZEC is that an hour and 30 minutes later, plus 370,000 people voted. Is it humanly possible? But it doesn't end there. Then there is the issue of identical polling results. There are at least 16 polling stations with identical results. Identical results for Chamisa, identical results for Mnangagwa, identical spoiled votes. And in all those places, Mnangagwa not only wins, but wins big. It's like a kid was playing with the figures. That, with respect, is not how an election is conducted.
We'll now give the opportunity to Mr. Kanengoni.
The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission cannot be taken to task to say, why is the voter turnout in my central at this particular level and not at that particular level? Voters behave the way they do. No one knows why. Maybe behavioral scientists may be able to answer the question if they study it.
Mr. Kanengoni, there's the averment that several polling stations showed identical results.
And the simple point we make is that there's no need to be theoretical about it. We have the returns. This is something that happened. We show you the returns. And we've put the returns for 2 of those polling stations here to illustrate the point.
You say it happened?
Yes.
But in his presentation, Pofu says it's actually 16 polling stations where the identical results. You heard it?
Yes, we did. Even in the affidavit, they put a bit more of the polling stations there. But we chose this to illustrate to the court. But for the rest, it did happen. It did actually occur.
We'll now go back to the applicant. Why go for speculative conclusions of manipulation?
The point that I wish to make is that this is evidence of manipulation by ZEC after the process. Now, if you go to what they call the primary data, you're going to see manipulated data. So the applicant cannot ask a court to open residue which has already been manipulated. If you go to the residue, you will drink from a poisoned well.
That is one of the most fallacious arguments that anyone has ever heard. I am not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be a lawyer. But that is an irrational argument. Let's understand what went on here. There are more than 16 polling stations in which the number of the total number of cast votes is exactly the same. Spoiled votes exactly the same. The number of votes cast for each of the candidates is exactly the same. But there's one common factor in all those cases. Mnangagwa not only wins, but wins big. It is a simple, straightforward case here. Somebody was looking at that V11 form and realizes that Mnangagwa did very well there. And in adding up the total number of votes, that V11 form was added to the total again. It's a duplicate entry. That is the rational explanation for it. There is no way you're going to have identical polling stations, polling identical figure in every respect, let alone more than 16 cases in 1 year, in one election. But the other point that must be emphasized here is that while the Chief Justice, Malawa, came to the same conclusion that any other rational person would have come, why don't you go to the primary data? The law says that after the counting of the votes, the polling station material in that election must be put in the ballot box and the ballot box sealed and signed by all the various stakeholders who were involved in conducting the elections at that polling station. That is the primary data we are talking about here. And it's kept for that purpose. If there is any dispute, the court will ask that that ballot box must be opened and what is inside verified. I can tell you now that if there's been a duplicate entry, there would have not been a duplicate ballot box because you can't duplicate polling station. So they would have found immediately that there are 8 ballot boxes that exist. The others are ghosts. So who is it who refused to have the ballot boxes opened? It is not ZEC. It is not the court. It is Jamisa's lawyers who refused to have the boxes opened. But to come back to the point I was making originally, that you cannot win rigged elections in Zimbabwe. This was a clear case where Mnangagwa's vote count was being topped up to get him over the line. How can you possibly win in such a process? It's impossible. We saw the same process being repeated last year's elections. According to Tim Pachelu, who were monitoring the elections much more closely than anybody else, they were over 1,000 polling stations, which Timpachedu, with all their people on the ground, could not get the voters' rolls for. But they got the V11 for. What is interesting about these polling stations is that the returns, the V11s from those polling stations, shows exactly what I'm talking about here. In one of the V11 forms of this ghost polling station, there were 999 votes cast from Nagawa and 0 for Chamisa. Now let's go back to the original. ZEC's own figures. There were about 5 million Zimbabwean voters on the voters' roll in last year's election. And there were over 10,000 polling stations. And simple arithmetic will show you that there were roughly about 500 voters. Because remember, in Zimbabwe, each polling station has got its own voters' roll. And those names will not appear in any other polling station. So dividing 5 million by 10,000 polling stations, roughly 500 voters in each polling station. And yet, one of these ghost polling stations, they managed to get a V11 form for. They found that 999 people had voted in that polling station. That's twice as many as any other of the polling stations. And they had all voted from Nagawa. I put the case to you that those are some of the ghost polling stations which were being used to top up Mnangagwa's votes to get him over the line. You can't win such an election. That is at the heart of it. Why both Chamisa and his fellow opposition leaders like Ngube and Tendai Biti are always keen to have this unity is because they've got to tell their supporters that if we are united, we will win these elections, regardless of the fact that the elections are rigged. That is the reason why. And it is in the interest of Chamisa to get as many of the opposition vote as he can. And it is in the interest of people like Tendai Biti and Welshman Ngube, who know that if they are going to stand any chance of winning any of the private seats, they cannot afford to divide the opposition vote. So let's not forget the reason why the opposition are participating in these flawed elections. It is out of greed, period. And they are using unity as a smoke screen behind which to hide why they keep on participating in these flawed elections. Here is Margaret Longo talking to that very subject. Why the opposition continue participating I beg your pardon. I pushed the wrong button there. Setting up all over again.
Social worker. You know, politics is not a business. This is what I want to remind most of our MPs and other people.
Do you think they look at it as a business?
Yes, they look at it as a business. Because they look at it as a business seriously. Because the moment they go, business and employment creation, because if they go to parliament, you are employed. You get a car, you get a stable salary, and you are paid until your term is over. Already you are employed. If you are out, you're out of employment.
If you serve 2 terms, you get a pension?
You get a pension. Then already, this is why people kill in politics. They kill to be in parliament. This is why we have violence in this country, because there is no employment. The only employment which is there is in politics. There is no other outside employment. So for them, a very good example is, look at what happened to CCC, the Triple C party. Have a look. When they lost, when they said they were rigged, what I expected from them, I expected all parliamentarians to say, we are not going to go to participate in a rigged system. And we are not going to sit in a rigged parliament. Because the elections have been rigged. So all of us were not going to parliament. Imagine what could have happened. We could have gone into new elections. There's no way ZANU-PF was going to roll alone.
You think so?
Yes.
Do they care?
Caring or not caring, the public would have forced them, because the majority of the people would want representation in parliament.
But they went anyway?
But they went.
Yes, they participated, and they insisted that in those areas in which the opposition had participated in one, they were liberated zones. Of course, that was nonsense. There's no such thing as liberated zone. One of the problems, for instance, in the last year's election is that we had no verified voters roll. And that affected all the constituencies in the country. There was no verified voters roll in the rural areas nor in the urban centers. So the whole process was flawed. But they were after the few gravy train seats, which they knew they would win, which they knew ZANU-PF gives away, which they've known all along ZANU-PF would give away. The same seats that David Coulthard was talking about in his book, in the quotation I'm showing you again on the screen. This is the political reality in Zimbabwe. Right now, Chamisa is preparing to stage a comeback. We are going to see him come back, and according to this ex-post unite with his old colleagues and convince people that now a united opposition would win the elections big, and thus con the people to participate in yet another flawed election to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. What do they get in turn? They get a few seats, a few gravy train seats as their reward. And so the nation's case of rigged elections will continue. This is the reality. The people of Zimbabwe have got to open their eyes and their minds if we are ever going to stop this madness. After 44 years of rigged elections, the last 24 of which, it must be said, ZANU-PF was only able to continue to rig elections with the connivance of the opposition. The challenge is, are we going to put an end to this madness? Or are we going to be so easily conned and perpetuate this madness? That, in my view, is the biggest challenge of our generation. I hope we will live to stop this madness. So far, we have not done so well. 44 years is no joke in this day and age. Think about it.